Hello, everybody. Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today we have a special guest host, Nicholas McCay. We have a special guest, Phoebe Tickell. Why don't we start, Nicholas? Why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll have Phoebe introduce herself.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Really appreciate it. So Nicholas McCay, I'm kind of the founder and head wrangler of Eclectic Spacewalk. So basically, Eclectic Spacewalk, I kind of came up with of seeing, how the Earth can be seen from space and what kind of that means for general culture, thought processes and stuff. And so I just have been making almost like a multimedia platform that, went out to Jason's homestead in September and had them on the podcast. Ashley Colby as well. So been kind of in the mix of things, writing essays, doing podcasts, short films, but I have a background in TV film, marketing management. And then now I am a grad student here in Munich at the Technical University of Munich in the Science and Technology Studies kind of program. So happy to be here and happy to talk with Phoebe and Jason about some DAOs, Web3, and blockchain.
Phoebe?
Great. Yeah, great to be here and nice to meet you both. And hi to everybody listening. My name's Phoebe and my background is a scientist. I started life in what we call the wet sciences. So like in a lab, working with chemicals and bacteria and that kind of thing. And so I started my life really in the technological space. I really think of the way my trajectory has gone is moving from the hardware of how we make systems change to the software, because essentially I started off thinking that working in renewables and biofuels and genetic engineering of bacteria and like tinkering with the mechanics of how we do things is actually what is necessary to create a life-sustaining and flourishing society for everyone. And then as I spent more time in science and started asking a lot of questions, I realized actually the hardware already exists to already like 10x the quality of life for everybody in a very short space of time. If we had the software in terms of the mindsets, the value systems, the economic systems, and those kind of invisible organizing systems that actually make us decide on what we do. And so I've followed that for the last like 9 years through systems thinking, everything from, exploring how we can connect to nature and nature immersion, nature connection, but then not being quite satisfied by just like, oh, people should spend time in nature, because actually the kind of core of the issue goes a lot deeper than just physically spending time in nature. It's really at the level of how we see the world, what we believe is possible. And that's led me to imagination. And so I started an organization called Moral Imaginations in 2020. And the vision of Moral Imaginations is really around that systemic shift of mindset and perspectives. And it combines like values and imagination, which I think come together. Well, I believe it comes together in a powerful tool, because if you have imagination without the values, you can end up creating things like bombs or techno-utopian societies where, nature no longer exists. But if you just have values, you lack that kind of creative energy of life to actually go from vision to action. So that's where I find myself today.
Nice. I guess right off the bat, the first question I have is, how do you think about how, if we're trying to kind of envision alternative affordances, let's say, how do we make sure that that is tied to biophysical realities, right? Laws of thermodynamics. Like how do we make sure that we embed our creativity in actual viable structures, and we're not just kind of weaving pies in the sky?
Such a good question. And I think that really links with this concept we've been throwing around of imagination activism, because actually just imagination doesn't lead to anything changing. And I think the long and short answer of it is focusing on doers. Like you have to be a doer to actually like be part of creating the change. Like if we're just thinking and talking and coming up with concepts, but not actually testing those in reality, like I've learned that the hard way. Like when you actually start trying to create change, like the order of complexity of how much more difficult that is than like coming up with theories and systems and concepts is just such a huge order of magnitude. So I'm not saying that the imagination piece and theory piece isn't as important, because if we're just doing without that, then we've got the kind of world that we're in today. But I think the converse of that is like, we cannot get stuck in just theorizing and imagining. And anybody who's done any kind of manual labor or like permaculture will know about this, because life doesn't follow the kind, when you try and like plant a garden, you've got this like perfect idea of how it's all going to work, and then suddenly you've got snails and you've got, you know, things that are going wrong, and so I think it's all about doing and iterating. And what do you think, Nicholas? That's my 2 cents.
No, it's good. But I guess following up on that point, like of getting your hands dirty and stuff. I mean, how have you kind of transitioned from, you know, going from a molecular, you know, kind of biology and signaling to that, you know, where you're focused on more regeneration? I mean, can you take us a little bit through of that kind of background of how you kind of saw, because it seems like you were kind of alluding to, you know, we don't need to just philosophize in ivory towers and, you know, tell people what to do. It's like, it really is an iterative and, you know, kind of ongoing process. So how did you get there? And then how maybe you can give some insights of, you know, how that went, or how you feel now?
Yeah, gosh, how I feel now. I feel like it's a constant interplay between the two. But just to start with, like when I was in the lab, I was never a theoretical scientist. Like I wasn't a physicist. That's why I went into genetic engineering, because actually even in science, you know, there are the scientists who are more foundational and just like on this quest for truth, which I find like extremely beautiful and incredibly important. And it's almost more akin to a form of artwork, of like just being on that pursuit of truth and discovering kind of new realities. And but that always felt like really divorced for me from this desire I had since a young age to try and create a better world. And like I think what ignited that for me was actually just the education system, because I was just so appalled by like by our education systems. Like it was really clear to me immediately, being in school, that you know, we were being kept in classrooms for like 8 hours a day, learning about things from textbooks. And like, we could literally learn a lot of this stuff in like 2 or 3 hours, like the kind of high level important parts. And then the rest of it could be spent like actually doing things or visiting places or like being in the world. And so I don't know where that came from, but I always felt like highly dissatisfied with the education system. And I think that's like what started to give me this sense of like, I guess there's some kind of, some people talk about like development and, you know, these like developmental stages. Like I don't know. I don't want to go down that route because it's a complex territory, but like there's some sort of shift that happened in me where I realized that like, I think in the guy who runs the STOA, Peter Lindbergh talks about like live players. Like I really remember that shift of going from like passively consuming the system I was in to being like, wait a second, like I'm 15 and I could see how I would do this differently. And like, why is that? Like, how is it that we're in a system that is like so clearly not optimized for what it's meant to be doing? And so I was immediately seeing that gap between kind of theoretical purpose and actually what happens like in physical reality and practically speaking. And so I had this urge of, whatever I was doing in my like work life, I wanted to contribute to bettering systems for everybody and bettering society. So as a scientist, I went down the track of genetic engineering and synthetic biology in bacteria. So actually like tinkering with bacterial DNA to create biofuels and renewables. And actually some of that also included working on the engineering part of like the bioreactors and like making that work. And actually like being a scientist and engineer really teaches you like how long things take. Like, and it's part of what also turned me off the path of staying in the lab, because I could see that over like 3 years or a PhD, you might elucidate like one genetic mutation that might contribute to like 60 mutations that might lead like a metabolic pathway that might one day create biofuels, but then that's like stage 1 of 20 of creating biofuels. So it was like quite a good training and being like, wow, like things take a really long time. And I think like the systems change, like regenerative change field could probably learn a bit from academic science in that. A lot of people frame academia as being very competitive, and especially science as being super competitive. But actually, what I found was there was a lot of like complex meta collaborations that happened in science because, you know, like with the images that just came out from the telescope, like showing us these like incredible visions of galaxies. Like when you take on goals and ambitions that are big enough, you realize that you can't do them alone. And so doing the math, you're like, okay, if our lab tried to do this, it would take like 80 years. So we have to partner with others to kind of divvy that up. So going back to your point of like how I transitioned out of that, at a certain point, I had a PhD offer to go and work at the Scripps Institute in California and do a PhD at the Craig Venter Institute. And that was like probably going to be like 6.5, 7 years. Like I'd just be coming out of the PhD now if I'd accepted that. And it's like kind of wild to think about how much has happened since then. But it was really then that I just felt like that I was having this growing sense of urgency as well, like being involved in the climate activism movement and like seeing some of the timelines and being like, wow, like if I do a PhD, I'll be graduating in like 7 years time and like the world might look completely different by then. Like I just can't operate on that kind of timescale. And so I went from there to starting a startup with a friend from university. So that was the big jump for me. It was like, okay, let's like try this entrepreneur thing. And we ran 5-day transformative learning experiences with teenagers age 11 to 18. And so that was really about shifting mindsets. And that was where this kind of work all started. And so that took us to Dubai and Hong Kong and Singapore. And so like we were doing a lot of work out in the Middle East and in Asia. And yeah, that was like another baptism of fire of, you know, you've got a plan of like how that's going to work and everything, you know, everything going wrong. And being in a team of like first time entrepreneurs who have never done this before and like promising things and then having to like pull it off and being stressed and jet lagged and tired. So that was a great and very stressful transition. And then moving on from there, like it's just been this interplay of theory, practice. So learning about, you know, training with Joanna Macy, spending time at Schumacher College, learning from people like Daniel Weil and like regenerative systems and being able to like build on my biological and ecology background, but with this kind of values driven kind of science, like, you know, Daniel's work and Joanna's work and other, you know, ecological thinkers and doers, like it's ecology, but it's also with this vision of a better world and like this kind of values driven design. So I never called myself a designer, but I guess that was the shift, like from from being a scientist to being a designer and an entrepreneur and trying to apply those values and visions and principles into like real world projects.
Very cool.
So maybe that we have you here, we could acquire your free consulting services for optimism.
Sure. Yeah, I want to know what kind of things you guys are up to. I mean, your listeners probably know. So
yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I'll just talk about my own path, right? So I kind of was part of what's now called the liminal web. You know, had another podcast called Both End, which is great, but it was a lot more kind of the theoretical conversation. So the question I asked you earlier was actually, it's also a question that I've been asking myself for a couple of years. And part of my shift towards, you know, helping to create kind of this Doomer optimism community is, you know, the need for action, right? The need to build real communities, develop real skills. You know, we focused a lot on just like food production, sustainable food production, local regenerative food systems, things like that. And now we're trying to kind of develop this network of people, mostly in the United States, but also around the world. And, you know, we're starting to get to the point where we're starting to meet up, like, you know, regionally. We're having like bioregional meetups later this summer, where, you know, basically in each region that there's somebody who can host. People are showing up, maybe spending a couple of days helping them with various projects around their homestead or whatever they happen to be working on. And when you were talking about the educational component and of moral imaginings, one kind of vision that I have, it's not my vision. I mean, a lot of people have talked about this, but this idea of like creating these bioregional field schools where basically people are learning on site, right? They're basically, they're building barns, they're barn raising, right? They're learning how to develop water systems and energy systems and food systems, as part of the education. Like they're actually on site building it as part of their education. And then, of course, the other component is, well, when you release people out in the world with that kind of experience, what are they going to do? Do they have access to land? Something about land accessibility and the larger political economy components. And so I'm thinking, when we're talking about moral imagining and wanting it to be iterative and responsive to feedback. I guess how would you help us kind of think about developing these, say, for example, these field schools or these meetups, right? In terms of, not just, I guess not just kind of moving automatically, based on our preconceptions, but like a bit more formal process of like, how do we re-envision what's possible here, right? How can we cast aside assumptions that are no longer valid, but also still be, still be tied to the real biophysical world and the necessities of that.
So a couple of provocations I think I would start by making. I think one of the aspects of this imagination piece that I think is really interesting to bridge with a lot of this very like deep design and redesign and re-envisioning work that is happening on a local scale. And like we're also doing work with like local communities and local councils and a borough in London to implement like imagination practices and systems like systemic redesign in place. But I think one of the interesting provocations is to really think about the next 10 years and the sort of numbers of people that will soon be like leaving cities, leaving existing systems, like that crumbling that is already happening and is only going to increase. And to really challenge ourselves by saying like, what would that field school system look like designed for 100 million people? Like just to already start there. And I know that I've come from spending a lot of time in kind of deep ecology circles and Schumacher College and like eco design circles. And there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction to scale. And it's always like scale doesn't matter. Like it's about creating the small kind of acupuncture points, which I also love. I think there's a lot of wisdom in the acupuncture point model that, it doesn't have to be 100 million people to make change. You can really make change using this butterfly effect and, holonic fractal theories of change. But I think that's the place I would start, is like going back to that piece about like massive ambition in science and how much that can really help breed radical collaboration. Because when we're in too small an ambition, the kind of squabbling and like governance issues and conflicts sink so many projects. And we saw that in Extinction Rebellion as well, which I've worked with on their governance and kind of self-organizing systems, that in the first like year of Extinction Rebellion, the systems worked really well. Like they didn't actually need a huge amount of like process and conflict resolution and like governance design and all of this more like horizontal collaboration stuff that I consult groups and organizations on. Like when there was just urgency and focus and like scale of ambition, people just made it work. They were just like, you know what, I trust you, let's move forward. Like that kind of, I find that very interesting. And I don't think it's talked about enough, that when we kind of scale our ambition, trust seems to increase because there's a sense of like shared alignment and purpose. So that would be like a starting point for me, is like, can we radically scale the imagination and the ambition of what you're talking about? Because actually, like, we know that it's going to be needed. And if we already start by thinking, if you start by designing for like 10 people, then you can always iterate and prototype and grow. The danger is that a lot of projects like start there and kind of slow down because they don't start with that larger ambition. Somebody told me recently that in carpentry, a pilot hole is like the kind of hole that you make in wood with the intention of creating a bigger hole in the pilot hole. And just an interesting metaphor of like, yeah, most projects start as just like they stay as pilot holes. Like we never see that kind of radical scaling. So that's one piece. And I'm kind of curious to hear how that lands for you and what does that bring up for you?
Yeah, well, I guess the other failure mode on the other side is having too large ambitions, but no pragmatic way to get there, no first steps. Yeah. And you become immobilized because it's like, oh, I need to build structures for millions of people. Well, I don't know how to do that, so I'm just going to stay in my bed and play video games. Right?
That's true. That we also don't want that. We want the.
And so it seems like what you're describing is kind of this balance of like, yeah, think big, but have a very clear idea of where to start, how to and where to start small, but with the addition of, don't limit your imagination to that small thing, but also, you should maybe limit your practical kind of just logistical planning, say early on to that smaller scale idea. I also wanted to bring up real quick this idea, of scale, and we often talk about scale and this difference between large scale and broad scale. Right?
Exactly.
And I think just based in the circles that you're around, that you're thinking in terms of kind of like broad scale networks that, it's like, you don't want to just build a lifeboat for you and your friends when, everyone else can come and jump on it and the whole thing's going to sink. But what does it mean to build 1 million lifeboats? Or 1 billion 8-person lifeboats, right?
Yeah.
And that's basically a networked, a network of small scale systems that, are human scale, but you look at the aggregate, it's actually pretty large scale. It's like an emergent large scale.
Yeah, and exactly. I was about to say that the kind of paralysis, I think the deparalysis mode comes from realizing that you don't have to do it alone, that kind of ambitious scaling can just make you think like, okay, so we know that Joe Brewer is doing this down in Colombia. We know this, we know all these people that are doing this in some form. How do we connect together to actually like 10x what all of us are doing? So it's like not stopping there and really thinking at that scale. And I find like maybe it's a scientific mind thing that like I find once I see like numbers on a page of like, oh, okay, like this is kind of the number that is realistic in terms of what we can expect in the next 5 to 10 years, that can like really help me raise my ambition and kind of get out of that paralysis of like, I don't know how many people and how big and how do I do this? It's like, okay, we can just break this down. Like, how do you engage 100,000 people? Like which networks are already engaging 100,000 and breaking it down like that. But I also appreciate that's not the way everybody works. But I do, I think that's a really important distinction, is the scaling across rather than scaling up. And can't remember, like, I think it's Meg Wheatley who also talks a lot about this, of like, the horizontal scaling, which is a lot more present in biomimicry as well. The kind of, copy paste across. And then on the other piece, the other question you had around moving between imagination and building, I think that's a very interesting question in the context of like local building with like physical materials, because also there is there's an inherent slowness to when you're working with nature, with permaculture, with building structures, with, in the software world, it can be a very, very fast, like iterative cycles and keep on shifting and changing. And I guess we can move on to talking a bit about DAOs and like kind of DAO design. But in the place of permaculture and working with nature, it's like how much can you like how fast can that iteration really be, and how much is it about also just slowing down into the rhythms of how you're kind of working with nature. I think So in moral imaginations, the practices and exercises we've developed are about shifting perspective. So we talk about re-indigenizing, which I think again is quite present in the kind of back to land, eco-village, eco-centers movement, really developing this imaginative muscle to look through the eyes of the other. So through the eyes of other people, through the eyes of like the non-human world. And we see ourselves as prototyping the kinds of practices that could become relevant in 10 years when rights of nature takes off for real. Because right now it's like we're seeing just the beginning of the rights of nature movement, and a couple of rivers have been given personhood. But when you actually scale that future forward and you imagine what it's like to actually have governance systems that represent the land and represent rivers and mountains and actually bring that back into our governance systems, it's really difficult to make the jump between the governance and the legal side and the actual like decision-making part, because we as like Western people who are totally disconnected, most of us are disconnected in terms of spirit, mind, body, and feeling from nature, from actually feeling like nature is a being and has like a will or like a sort of animistic desire, or even if it's like a collectively projected animistic personhood, like developing that muscle of being able to connect with nature through imagination, through introspection, through, you know, what Gregory Bateson calls ecology of mind, being able to actually sense into that and make more informed decisions from that place. Like I find that fascinating and like completely under-researched and very, you know, on the edges of what would be considered like a scientific, like psychological research field. But that's sort of where we are. And we do the same with future generations as well, which helps expand time perspectives. So again, like exercises and practices that enable people to imagine they step 200 years into the future and look through the eyes of a seventh generation being. You know, again, drawing on the indigenous concept of seventh generation thinking, how can we practice and re-indigenize the way that we actually see the world and make our values clearer through the practice of introspection and collective introspection, collective meditation, collective sense-making practices.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's great. Just to jump in and kind of, I guess, link with some of the things. I mean, you mentioned a lot of great stuff that, you know, we could spend hours on this, but I mean, Daniel Wall's Designing Regenerative Cultures book. I mean, that was one of my first things that really kind of opened my, you know, eyes on a lot of things. But then I guess instead of focusing on culture, Stephanie Lipp was on, you know, earlier with Jason and Ashley, and you guys talked about not exactly like a big tent, but then, you know, making, you know, wormholes through constellations of different people. And I thought that was a super interesting thing. But I guess what I really want to ask you, because you have it in your Twitter profile, is culture change through systems, narratives, and imagination activism. Kind of talked about imagination activism and culture change, but as a filmmaker and a podcaster, et cetera, like the narrative, you know, I think is a huge, you know, way to storytell, to get buy-in, you know, a lot of those things. So maybe not just talking about like what can, you know, doomer optimism consultancy, you know, narration look like, but then also maybe talk about your experience, because I loved the Impossible Train story that you guys did, you know, a cool animation, you know, about all the things that we're kind of talking about. So can you just kind of maybe talk a little about, you know, narrative storytelling and kind of how to get that, you know, maybe linkage, you know, between all these kind of things that we keep talking about?
Yeah, we're some kind of like intangible designers that are largely focusing on this upstream part of like the physical reality, but also find it very important to not, yeah, I guess going back to the beginning of our conversation, like the physical part and iterating and continuing to have that loop is really, really important. And the reason we think it's really important to start at the level of imagination is because if you just start at the level of narratives and stories, you might try and change the narratives and stories, but if you haven't shifted your perception, if you haven't actually shifted the way, like epistemology and the way of seeing the world, and this is where people like Nora Bateson's work comes in really relevant as well, like how we can actually shift the way we see all the way down to the level of like being aware of our propensity to create, to reduce reality into objects, and like even just like even that, and even the fact that our language systems are largely focused on using nouns compared to more, indigenous languages that have a higher frequency of verbs. So there is this deeper level of perception that I think if you start at that level and shift there, then the narratives and the stories, like you open up a whole new space of how you even tell stories, not just the content of the stories. And so the Impossible Train story was really about creating this mass participatory imagination exercise that could help people make sense of the pandemic in a different way. Because so much of the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, so much of what was going on was this kind of urgent, like warlike metaphors and like language around like, how are we going to like fight the pandemic? And there was a lot of this like urgent fixing solution focused language. And so what that video was trying to do was to actually take people on a journey where, rather than telling them the new narrative or the new story, it created an imagination exercise where they could touch in with themselves, go deeper, shift the way they see the world, and then come up with their own narratives and stories to decide what is possible out of the pandemic. But I'm definitely like somewhat jaded about like the pandemic. And I always remind myself like to remember that we're just in this like very short time scale in terms of how far we can see and what we can see the impacts were of the pandemic. But it felt like both such an extremely exciting and also like, very traumatizing and a very painful time for a lot of people. But I felt like there was a real tear in the like business as usual reality fabric, and this little glimpse of like what else is possible. And it's interesting to see how many new projects there are in the space of imagination and storytelling like since the pandemic, because I think people saw through the it's almost like if you're like in the theater and then like the back of the theater like tears and you see that actually like it's just a stage, and you're like, oh wait, like this is just a stage, we're just all like acting, and we could just act a different way. So yeah, I'm fighting that sense of disappointment about like how little has happened and how much we're kind of going back to business as usual. But I do see this massive shift. Like I see a big shift happening around the story of climate. Like since coming out of the pandemic, I'm really noticing in the last 6 months, and I'm just catching myself saying coming out of the pandemic when actually like it's ongoing and like never ending. So that's like an interesting narrative as well in itself. But at least, as collective consciousness lets go of the pandemic, or dominant media systems reports less on it, I am noticing a different kind of texture of response to climate change. And I'm just recalling a conversation with my dad a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying like, I was thinking about Extinction Rebellion, and I think they might be right. And I'm really glad that they did what they did. And I just thought it was very interesting that was very unexpected. And there are quite a few conversations that I keep happening with people who previously were not that engaged or kind of tapped into climate and kind of climate emergency. But I think there is a sense of these repeating kind of crises, like the heat waves are coming now after the pandemic, and I think it's becoming impossible to ignore. So that's both extremely depressing and exciting for those of us who have been like working in this field for like 10 years or more. I sense that something is shifting, but it's likely just like the first of hundreds of shifts, and there's going to be a lot of ups and downs in that. I'm curious, the name of the podcast is Doomer Optimism, so it's kind of topical. It's like a topical theme. And I was just like, somebody sent me this podcast I recorded in 2018. It was like titled like Apocalypse. And I was like, and around that time, I like coined this phrase of doom porn, and like the danger of like doom porn, of like, becoming kind of hooked on these narratives of apocalypse. And yeah, this kind of addiction to the really apocalyptic descriptions of the future, which now feels like really irrelevant, because I really feel like that's where we're at. So curious what you think.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, as you're describing, the pandemic is when things started feeling real. I mean, I think for older millennials, the 2008 financial crisis already hit that. And then, of course, Trump getting elected, and, that also was a shock to the system of many. But it seems like now we're achieving, we're going to a phase, an exponential. When people talk about exponential collapse, we're hitting a phase where it's starting, early on in exponentials, doesn't feel like much is happening, right? You're still on the kind of that part of the curve, but then it starts, the acceleration starts accelerating. And it seems like we're starting to hit that moment where we're coming out of the pandemic, and now we're in kind of a food crisis, global food crisis, global energy crisis. A lot of maybe our industrial systems are starting to buckle. And, the name of the podcast is kind of this acknowledgement that, hey, we need to kind of like start with sober eyes, right? Just, let's be realists, right? Let's just stone cold facts, like what's happening. It looks like, we've been perpetuating unsustainable systems for decades, and, you can't do that forever, and the bill is coming due. But as you say, just fetishizing doom porn and apocalyptic, kind of imagery doesn't really do anybody any good, right? It just makes people depressed, suicidal, fatalistic, all of these things that are actually self-fulfilling prophecies. And so the doomer optimism part is like, okay, like if we acknowledge that, let's say we're in a collapse phase of civilization, or, I like the panarchy kind of systems dynamics model of like, we're in the back loop and there's a release. And we can grieve about that, because there is going to be a lot of collateral damage. There already has been a lot of collateral damage, and there has been for centuries, for indigenous cultures all around the world. But it's catching up with everybody. What does it mean to then, grieve, but also see it as an opportunity, right? See it as an opportunity to reimagine, new things that are possible, because the dominant systems are the gravity holding us to the dominant systems is weakening, right? And so that can lead to very, very nasty, very apocalyptic outcomes, and it probably will in many parts of the world, but it can also lead to new experiments in being. And how can we help shift towards that latter option for many of us as possible, right?
And when you created the podcast and called it Doomer Optimism, was there any fragment of your being that believed that there was any other future possible than the kind of catastrophic civilizational, at least semi-collapse?
Not really. It wasn't so much of whether collapse was happening. I think most of us kind of think that it is happening. It's more of like, what does that mean, or what could it mean? So you can think of collapse in terms of, apocalypse and everybody dies a fiery death, or you can think of it as collapse, meaning that our current life support systems that we've grown complacent with and are unsustainable are not long for this world, are being pulled out from under us. And so what can that mean in terms of developing alternative systems? In for example, a much lower energy, linear throughput, materials throughput way, right? Or in a more regenerative way. A lot of things in kind of the collapse of systems become possible that weren't possible before. And so what is possible? Can we lean into that?
Yeah. And I'm sure that apocalypse means like both crisis and opportunity, or like breaking dawn, I think is like the something in the etymology. So was this podcast created not that long ago? Was it like a couple of years ago?
The fall, right? I was big on you guys when I came in September, Jason, for you guys to get it going.
Yeah, so we started with the series on the Stoa.
Right. That's right.
And, that was around the time that Ashley and I were starting to know each other. And then another friend suggested a podcast. Tress suggested a podcast, and yeah, Nicholas, you were kind of a believer, an early believer in the vision.
Oh yeah,
that was very encouraging. So it's still pretty new, and I think we're still pretty nascent in terms of, we've had like 50 some conversations, or almost 60 at this point. But in terms of actually now this kind of online community becoming more embodied, meeting up in real life, developing real life projects. So yeah, I think we're still at the very kind of, early stages of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's really great. And it's mainly in the US, but could be further afield.
Yeah, it's mainly in the US. Most of the people that just we've happened to connect with are in the US, but there's some further afield as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like Ashley, for example, I mean, she lives in Uruguay, right? And she's been active in communities in Uruguay for a long time. Nice. So yeah, I mean, that's the idea is basically a lot of it is just connecting with people who have already been in these spaces, what I call OG doomer optimists for a long time, right? And it's not like we're reinventing the wheel. It's just kind of like a new burst of energy in this direction. And so it's connecting with a lot of the people who've been doing it for a long time. Maybe they become a little bit burned out or disaffected, and it's like, hey, like, let's keep the energy going.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I have this like strange contradiction of feeling both like at the beginning of a very long journey of this kind of work, and also like tired and kind of burnt out, like done with it. I'm like, you know what, like 9 years of like running full pelt at this system is intense. And so yeah, it's also about knowing like when and how to cycle in and out, and like, yeah, what nourishes you. And a lot of the work of like Adrienne Marie Brown is very relevant here, like her stuff around like pleasure activism, and how do you kind of bring joy into these movements where you're literally staring into the abyss, fighting the current system, being sabotaged in all sorts of ways. Like it's intense. It's not something like I spend a lot of time talking about, but I do think it's important to talk about, probably more than it currently is.
One thing that we emphasize is that there's an interesting confluence of what's necessary and what's actually regenerative, kind of on a spiritual level, right? For example, learning to grow your own food, having a garden, I think, we need like 100x times more just gardens in the world, right? Just backyard gardens, right? And that's a very nourishing, kind of spiritually, psychologically nourishing activity. And so a lot of it is like, hey, like living more, kind of place-based, ecologically, and culturally kind of focused lives. It actually feels really good. Right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of, for, a lot of people, it's, the lead in isn't, hey, climate change is happening, ecological collapse, peak oil, whatever it is, political decay. It's like, hey, this is actually a really nice, lifestyle, and we should make it available for more people. Right.
Yeah, totally. And yeah.
And so I think for a lot of people respond more to that than, than, hey, like, if you don't do this now, you're going to die.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Know your audience. Yeah, that's so related to imagination activism, because I've worked with so many activists over this last couple of years, and like a lot of them think that the way to build a movement is kind of shouting at people and hammering them with facts and guilt tripping them. And, like even just like a few weeks ago, I was at an event with a big corporate who had brought in some young climate activists to kind of be at their event. And the climate activists had like an hour on the stage, and they spent the whole time just basically being like, this is your fault. This is, these are the facts. Like, and it's like, if you're listening to that and you literally have no connection to climate change, like, I think there's like such a sophistication upgrade needed in terms of like narratives, imagination, like understanding how human beings make sense of realities, and also a lot more empathy and compassion of like actually putting yourself in the shoes of someone who hasn't had the privilege of, you know, whatever educational path it is, or whatever family it is, or whatever life path that has led like the three of us to actually have an awareness of what is going on and to kind of find our way out of the matrix, see the gaslighting that is happening, you know, at the level of media and advertising, and like these huge amounts of manipulative forces that keep us blinded to what is actually happening in the world. So I do feel there's a massive empathy gap there. And I think that's like really at the core of the imagination work as well. It's like, how can you help people like decolonize their imaginations? And that's what this article you mentioned at the beginning, Nicholas, is about. It's about like, how do we rewild the imagination? Like it's not necessarily people's fault if they are in a lifestyle or in a set of mindsets and premises and presuppositions that are keeping them not caring about the planet. Like it's not like people are bad people, that's why they don't recycle. Like there's such a like empathy humanity gap, I think, when it comes to some of the kind of activist movements and people who are intent on like changing people's minds rather than understanding why they are in that kind of life and set of, you know, decisions that they've made. Which, you know, there's that really well-known phrase that like walk a lifetime in somebody's shoes and you'll make the same decisions as they would make. So really coming from that starting point, I think, can completely change the way that we interact with people in our movements.
Nice.
Is there something also to be said? I think Jason brought it up a little bit and you touched on it, is like trust. I mean, definitely there's an empathy gap, but then also, you know, a trust gap of like, you know, who kind of, it seems like when you're working next, or, you know, when you live next to someone, there's almost this like understood trust or kind of things when you're working with someone, et cetera. But then it's very difficult to kind of trust if, say, temporality, like age or distance or et cetera. And that's kind of maybe the promise of some of the new kind of technological fixes, if you will, like decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, Web3, you know, it seems like that's kind of the underlying narrative or even in the heart, baked into the hardware. So I don't know if you kind of want to kind of riff on some of that, because I think that'd be a good, like, at least talking point. But then at the same time, maybe not to the effect that it goes, I guess, maximalist, because like we were just talking about is like being, you know, connected to like the land or connected to people, et cetera. And then, you know, you have kind of some of the groupings or people like in the space, like Balaji. I don't know if you've seen his new book, The Network State, you know, trying to basically just, you know, make a state out of thin air, which like there's definitely wants and desires of that. You know, the nations, Jason and I have talked about the nation state, you know, as in its current iteration being kind of going out by the wayside. But then how do we kind of like thread that needle or kind of do the tension in between of utilizing the products that, you know, are available to us, but then also kind of keeping our eye on some of the values that, you know, we've just been talking about, especially like the trust, you know, that's a huge thing I think that would be interesting to kind of talk about.
Yeah, so trust is such an interesting one because, you know, trust is a noun, but trust is not a thing. Trust is not really thingifiable. And I think that is at the heart of the tension, but like I have around these kind of trustless, you know, like the DAO reality of just like, we can make full trust and like almost kind of automating trust. When trust is a dance, like trust is really, the more I trust you, potentially the more you will behave in a way of trust. So like, it's not a thing. It's a relational thing. And it's very interesting. Like when trust, you know, you don't always know when trust is there, but you know when it's not there. And it's like, like one of these, like it's an interesting phenomenon. And like on the other side, you know, there's a lot of criticism of this idea of like automating trust in digital blockchain-based systems and DLT, like distributed ledger systems. And one of the common arguments is like, if we just automate trust, then, we'll live in a dystopian reality where like nobody needs to trust each other anymore. And it's like the ultimate libertarian, atomized, individualistic reality, which I can see the truth in. And yet from my interactions like within DAOs and like blockchain-based communities, like I've definitely experienced like very deep community in those places. But meanwhile, you can have like these, dark DAOs, like, you can have DAO. It enables, it's like, it's always everything. It's like that film that's just come out, Everything Everywhere All at Once. It's like every time I'm asked a question, I'm just like, it's everything. Like you can experience both. It's all about how we use our tools. It's not about the tools themselves. And my criticism of the criticism of DAOs is that currently we have to put our trust into government, or we have to put our trust into monopolistic corporations. Like when I pay somebody I don't know, I trust Visa to be the middleman of that transaction. So trying to pretend that like currently we're in like a totally trustful way of living, and that moving to DAOs would like automate that out is also not accurate. And so there's this question, I guess, I think it also again comes down to scale, because if we're in a village, village context and setting, trust will be mediated in a very different way, like through gossip, through these kind of like protocols that work on the scale of like 150 people. If we decide that we do need these systems that scale to like hundreds of thousands, millions of people, then in terms of design, there does need to be an abstraction of trust, and that is currently sitting in a certain way. And I guess the proposal of DAOs and kind of network states and societies is to mediate that in a way that gets rid of a certain kind of centralized power, but actually just transfers it to a different kind of centralized power. So it's a decision, I think. Which kind of centralization do we want? Because blockchain-based systems are not decentralized. Like I find that one of the biggest like double think phenomena of the whole scene. It's like, why
do your actions are recorded forever on an immutable ledger? That's so decentralized.
So decentralized. And like also like whales, if you have more computing power, like it's just not decentralized. I don't know what's going on with that. Like why, when are we going to have that conversation in a slightly more realistic way? I remember in like some of the kind of early day workshops in like around Ethereum governance, like I was part of a group that was doing like the legal and governance design for with the Ethereum Foundation. And like at the heart of that was like, we want this to be decentralized, and ultimately it isn't. And how do we create systems that can kind of separate out the plutocracy based system from like a more democratic system? And there are a lot of mechanisms being prototyped and created to do that. Like I have no doubt that the DAOs and these kind of mechanism design that is happening in that space is really important, even if we're not at a place right now where any of it looks like really ideal for kind of societal design. I was having a conversation with Kia from Gnosis recently and talking about like what is the kind of sell of like DAOs and blockchain and crypto to people who are really not engaged in that space and actually like highly critical and suspicious and kind of cynical. And I thought she said something really interesting, which was like, actually it's the imagination potential of like even allowing people giving people the ability to imagine a different economic system or a different coordination system, like even just the ease with which you could create like a multi-sig wallet, like that's already such a huge imagination kind of window opener, because it's like just enables people to think like, how would my life be different? Like how could it be different if I could coordinate like really easily with my friends? Or like, how would it be different if I could like trust somebody, in Egypt and like immediately transfer them money without like any issues and any kind of bank transfer faff? Like even just on that basic level, I think it's a highly useful experiment.
Yeah. there seems to be, we're seeking out a barbell strategy of, on the one hand, recovering, I would say, traditional community life, right? Like a lot of us, you know, a lot of people talk about modernity, you know, this boogeyman of modernity, which you know, there's definitely a lot of dark sides to it, and one being that it has atomized people. The state and corporations have kind of hollowed out civil society, right? And so a lot of, you know, a lot of it, I think, is just, we're going to have to recover, you know, pretty kind of traditional forms of social interactions. Not all traditional forms, right? Some we might want to dispense with. But, you know, at the same time, how do we coordinate that, you know, so we're not naive about larger scale game theory and geopolitical dynamics and all of these things. And this requires, you know, transnational mutual aid networks and all of these things. And so yeah, I know, like in the doomer optimism sphere, we definitely fall more on the skepticism side of these technologies. Like, it's kind of like we're maintaining openness and like curiosity, or at least I'm trying to do that. But at the same time, you know, we're like, okay, the network state, Balaji, you know, with your archipelago of physical localities that don't have any kind of accountability to democratic processes, there, it just sounds like multinational corporations 2.0. Like, are you the new elite who has no accountability to anybody but your global network, and you're not embedded in real, you know, eco-cultural processes? No thanks, right? And so it's like, and so there's like this tension, you know, maybe there will be some kind of synthesis here that'll be kind of healthy. So I think that's, it seems like that's what we're all trying, and you know, and it's like a lot of people are like schizophrenic about it. It's like, it's either one or the other, right?
Yeah.
But like, to hold both at the same time, to hold that tension in your being at the same time, you know, requires, you know, it's hard, right? It requires kind of a leap in, you know, some kind of development. Okay, so we have about, I know you have a time constraint here. You need to get going in a few minutes.
Yeah, I got a couple of minutes. I've got some thoughts to kind of wrap up. And I also think it's quite a nice jumping off point for a second conversation if we want to go more into like the DAO. Like, I'd love to dig into this a little bit more, because back in like 2015, I remember like discovering, I was trained by Joanna Macy in 2016, which in a way she could sit as like an archetype of like the most like kind of ecological warrior, Buddhist activist, California, like 90-year-old badass hippie. And I just come from like Craig Venter's lab in Silicon Valley. And I was like, whoa, like this gradient is really intense. This is like jumping into like an Arctic ice pool from the desert. And I had this dream of like, could I like somehow wrangle, and I still want to do it. Like, sometimes I have these like ideas, and then like 6 years later, I'm like, oh yeah, like maybe it's time to do that. I feel like this should happen, of bringing together like Joanna Macy and like Elon Musk for a conversation, and just to have the conversation, just to break the like impossibility of that conversation. Because
at least help heal the rift in our own minds, even if they don't agree. It's like, our own mind, you know, there would be like, everyone else will be watching, you know, it's like it'll be like a healing process for everybody, because right now it's so schizophrenic.
Exactly.
Yes, their own shadows against each other, you know.
Some kind of integration, exactly. And I think for doomer optimism, I would be super interested. Like, I feel like some of the things that took me into solar punk and to like really associate with solar punk was that gradient, and that need for some kind of holism and some kind of integration between these different parts of myself, which were like, technology is great, we need technology. Ecology is great, we need ecology. Why are these groups like so not even in conversation? Like, there are values here that they share. And it's interesting that I've then ended up working in imagination and values, which almost goes into like a meta kind of integration space. But kind of riffing off that, I feel like for doomer optimism, it would be really interesting to sketch out some like design tensions. Like, often in in systems design, there's a practice that I like to use where you like, you have like two poles, like, in the crudest sense, it could be like techno-utopianism and like deep ecology. And then you've got the ability to be like, where are we on this tension? And like, how do we move between the two? And how do we like reach integration? Because I think that's probably one of the biggest like risk factors of any movement, is that they end up like just falling into the fractionization and kind of tribalism and further like lack of integration of society and different tribes. So like sketching out some of those tensions and making sure that you find ways to embed the movement between the two, I think would be really interesting from a systems design perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I also want to, we have this kind of, we see ourselves as kind of a collective, and one kind of heuristic that we have is, if we have people who we've interviewed or co-hosted, Nicholas, if you also want to host conversations on this platform, it's available to do that. And so, for example, if you wanted to host a conversation with one of us, outlining this kind of thinking process, this kind of, integrating our psychologies, that would be really interesting. Or if there was somebody, else that you felt you really want to talk to, or have, you have to go.
I love it.
Yeah, you really want to have a conversation.
Drafting the email to Elon Musk right now.
Okay, yeah.
I'm in regardless.
If you want to interview Elon Musk on Doomer Optimism, you're welcome to.
Amazing. Great. Wow. I'm just.
Or if you want to have Elon and Joanna, host a conversation on Doomer Optimism, you're welcome.
I really like that. I feel like as a kind of impossible mission for this next decade, I'm going to put it on my bucket list, or see if anybody else listening might be able to wrangle it. We can put it on our like collective bucket list.
There we go. Cool.
Fantastic.
All right.
Great.
Well, we'll let you go. We're a minute past your time constraint, so we'll let you go.
Okay.
But you. Yeah, we'll do this again. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.